All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for getting up at this early hour to hear me talk about Ancoura. So this morning I would like to talk about, I guess, how I've encapsulated Ancoura, which is a place of hope and healing. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this with you. So I'm going to talk most basically, as the outline here mentions, about the mission and history of the organization, about the current residents who occupy the homes, our approach to housing issues generally, and then I thought I'd do a little bit about how the residents and the staff have coped with COVID-19 since its onset. Now, when Ancoura was founded, they gave some thought to a name that would be a little bit original, and they consciously drew upon several other words to put together new words. So it represents anchor, courage, encouragement, encouragement, and heart from the French word coeur. So that's where they got the name from. So I think it's quite a nice name. So what is Ancoura? Essentially, in a technical sense, it's a federally incorporated registered charity. It received its letters patent back in 2008, its incorporation. And it also acquired a charitable status, which was granted a little bit after that and was backdated to 2018. Its mission essentially is, as I understand it from the founders and the board members that I've spoken to, is to construct a compassionate society free from stigma and discrimination, where people living with mental illness are full contributing members. And I would say that this adheres closely to the First Unitarian's principle number 1, which is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So that's kind of how I think they originally framed the principles and mission of Ancoura. So if we get a little bit into its history, it was inspired by a groundbreaking organization in Montreal known as L'Abri en Ville, which had been formed in 1990 through an interfaith community in Montreal. And so it was set up first. It's kind of the mothership, if you like. And they stress the importance of friendship and the restorative power of community, with a strong belief that ordinary people can make a difference to other folks. And L'Abri also had a similar model to us. They're not so much in houses, they're in apartments. So they have 3-bedroom apartments, and their first apartment opened in 1991, and they opened 1 new apartment a year until they had 10 apartments by 2001. And they more or less stopped at 10. And I think there are good reasons for that. And they've been, we've kind of followed the same pattern at Ancoura, because you want to maintain a certain size and intimacy that if you grow too big and you have too many people, then you need more staff, and you kind of lose some of that understanding and intimacy that I think really helps. So the representatives from L'Abri en Ville came from Montreal to Ottawa in 2007, and they presented to 43 interested persons about this unique mental health model that they were pioneering. And from February 2007 to June of 2008, the core of the interested Ottawa volunteers studied the L'Abri model, its philosophy, and established a series of working groups to consult with mental health groups and hospitals in Ottawa. They actually also paid a study visit to L'Abri to go and examine it and see how it was working on the ground. So through that process, eventually they established an organization and opened their first home in Ottawa in 2009. which is known as, we have names for our homes, and that one is called Jasmine. It's a 3-bedroom townhouse. And the model was at the time and continues to be based on the idea that there would be a paid professional counselor or social worker who would provide problem solving and assistance and meet with the residents on a weekly basis. So there you can see the ensuing kind of chronology of how they've added homes each year since 2009, with our 7th and most recent one added in the spring of 2018. So we have 7 homes, 3 residents a home, so 21 residents at the moment. Now these homes are spread around the city. They're some here in the central west end and then some in the east end of the city. So in terms of its structure, as I mentioned, it's a nonprofit registered charity. It has a board of directors that varies a little bit. That's presently at actually 9, but it's been higher. And for a time when I joined, in fact, we were missing a few directors. So we've brought in 3 or 4 new ones since I've been there. So we were up to 10 until a recent resignation. And we have a membership structure where the members who are active and supportive meet once a year in an AGM, excuse me, and vote and hold the board accountable for its various actions. It currently has a complement of 3 staff, 1 full-time person, one of our counselors, and 2 part-time staff. I'm one of the part-time staff. I work 3 days a week. In theory, in practice, often more than that, and certainly in the month of November, a lot more than 3 days a week. I would say that our board members have a diverse skill set and share a passion for helping those less fortunate and those who have been stigmatized in the past. So that's their kind of guiding set of convictions that they come to Ancoura with. They want to make a difference, and they believe in the model, and they each bring different skill sets and backgrounds, and they all contribute something. And because of the small size of the staff, we rely a great deal on the board for their involvement. They usually, one of them will chair a committee and do a lot of the heavy lifting associated with that committee. So it's very much a directly implicated, actively working board. All right, a word or two about the residents. You can see that they're folks with a history of fragile attachment to the housing market. Many of them have previously been in shelters or other group homes, congregate living settings. Some, 1 or 2, I think. I haven't met many yet, but have been homeless. So they come from a pretty precarious position. And as you will note, they are all living with a diagnosed form of mental health or mental illness, and schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression. Their approach was that they're usually people who are able and desirous to live independently with support. So they've kind of come to us after maybe some other context or setting, and they want to live now independently. They are receptive to involvement with volunteers. So that's one of the conditions when we interview folks for residency at Ancoura. They're willing to participate in social activities. So that's also very important. And they're all connected to a health professional, usually following a prescribed pharmacological regime. They tend to be, we've tended to choose people who are 25 years of age or older, with a good understanding of health issues. They tend to be people as well who are eager to live with others, and we have both genders in their own same-sex houses, essentially. And finally, I guess you could say they are recipients in the main of the Ontario Disability Support Payment Program or other private long-term disability payments. So they get a payment, a monthly stipend from the province, and then that comes to us, and we basically take that and supplement it to cover their rent and some other things. So they're all pretty much on ODSP. I think we can also say these are some of the characteristics of them. They're motivated, very motivated to stay on their medication regimes. That's one of the conditions. They have no current history, or current substance abuse. We have had some in the past who've had those issues, but that's not presently an issue for those people. So there's no current substance abuse at all. And we make it a condition that there be no history of violence there at all. That's just a non-starter for us. They tend to be connected to a hospital where they will have regular outpatient visits. They have come to understand their illness, I think our coordinators would say. And so they have an understanding, and they live with the cycles and rhythms of that illness and manage it usually pretty well now. And they accept finally our house rules. We have a series of house rules which require certain undertakings and behaviors on their part. And they're not unreasonable, so they live with those. So as I mentioned, our approach to housing is that we have 3-bedroom townhouses. We have 5 volunteers for each home. So this is a key part of Ancoura. And there are staff support. So I think the place to begin here is that there's a very careful, deliberate vetting process that Ancoura follows, which serves hopefully to ensure that there's good chemistry between the residents. They are living quasi-independently, but they do look out for each other. I think the historically low turnover confirms that the model has worked very well and has tremendous merit. There isn't much turnover in our 7 homes. The volunteers visit several times a month and tend to steer clear of counseling and discussion of life problems, but instead focus on mutual interests, pastimes, enjoyable recreational activities, outings, trips to the cinema, sport attendance, those kinds of things. They become companions and friends of the residents. And so they effectively provide friendship, encouragement, companionship on a longer term basis, which helps to foster trust and predictability with the residents. The visiting volunteers also adhere to a code of conduct, as the residents have a code of house rules, which they must follow in their interactions with the residents. And so we give them some fairly extensive training on how to conduct their relationships with the residents. And those things include being mindful of the power dynamics within the volunteer-resident relationship, as the volunteer has a position of power to influence the resident. They're also very mindful of personal boundaries and confidentiality. And one of their main objectives is to demonstrate respect so that the dignity, individuality, and rights of the resident are protected. And I think we can say that these visiting volunteers that support each home are actually the key distinguishing feature of the Ancoura model. They are what makes Ancoura exceptional, as very few or not many other congregate living settings employ this approach. Many places will house people, many will have either live-in or visiting staff, but they don't have this web of outside volunteers that come in. COVID has been a bit of an exception of late, but that come in and see the residents socially on a regular basis. And that's, I think, our real value add. So there's an example, a photo of one of the homes. We lease and rent our 3-bedroom units from private landlords. We don't own any of them at the moment. And our houses are spread across the city. There's a typical example of the inside of one of the houses, and we receive generous gifts of used furniture from our supporters. And we have periodic or occasional volunteers who have been willing to come in and paint the homes when there's a change in residency and when there needs to be some upgrade and upkeep. So it's all done through donations of both materials and labor to keep the houses in a good state. So the coordinators, they're the folks that work with, we have two of them, as I mentioned, one full-time and one 3 days a week. So they tend to be, they don't engage in psychosocial counseling per se, but instead help to manage the daily life, problem solve, suggest practical solutions to issues. So they're there to kind of, they're not giving psychiatric advice and counseling. Each resident has his or her own medical care provider, but they do provide this other type of more kind of lay counseling. They do, though, try to ensure, the one thing that they are kind of on top of is ensuring that the resident adheres to his or her medication regime, and they help to facilitate the appointments with doctors and psychiatrists to make sure that they get to their appointments and that they interact. Now, the coordinators have two sorts of meetings between themselves and the residents on a monthly basis. House meetings where everyone is present. So the coordinator will come in and the three residents will be there and they'll talk about various issues. And then individual one-on-one meetings, which happen less frequently, about once every 10 or 12 days with each of the residents, where the coordinator meets alone with that resident. And the kinds of topics that they might focus on would include, as I mentioned, medication, issues relating to the running of the house, how the residents are getting along amongst themselves, and various follow-up that the coordinators do about the volunteer activities and whether those are happening and whether the residents are enjoying them and so on. Overall, the coordinators are encouraging the residents to assess their own progress in setting and attaining some goals. I mean, they're not necessarily, go and get a job or whatever, but we're trying to make sure that each person has a sort of set of personal goals and is striving to achieve those, generally towards to health, well-being, integration, if that's what they want. Some folks eventually want to live completely independently, so getting their own apartment. Others, it might be going back to school, doing some training. So they kind of help, I guess, gently chaperone those issues along to ensure that progress is made. Each of the residents has access to an after-hours on-call number in the event that they have an urgent problem. So outside of the working day, they can call this number, and it goes to one of our two coordinators. But they also may avail themselves of various crisis lines that are run by specialized agencies in the city. There are suicide prevention lines and various other lines, emergency lines that they can use if they need to. So our kind of program of events that we run on a yearly basis consists of a number of much anticipated things. These ones here I've highlighted are the kind of normal activities that form a part of Ancoura's calendar. So the annual gala dinner, which happens most years in May, Christmas party or December party, an annual barbecue in the summer. There was, until recently when they folded, an arrangement we had with the Champions baseball team where a lot of our residents would attend those games. An annual cottage outing, because one of our supporters has a cottage and is very kindly, I understand, made it available to the residents one day in the summer. So those are the kinds of things that normally we do, but of course they've all been put on hold for the moment. Yeah, they're eagerly looked forward to by the I guess the members, the residents, the donors, and the staff each year. All right, so I guess I thought I would talk a little bit about how we've coped with COVID-19 and its impact on the homes, on the coordinators, on the volunteers. So, I mean, clearly these are some of the things I'm pointing out there: isolation, aggravation of existing symptoms, reduced social interactions, and then, like everybody else, increased need for PPE and other cleaning and foodstuffs. Fortunately, due to strict adherence to the Ottawa and provincial public health guidelines, we've had no positive cases of COVID-19 among our residents. Our coordinators have followed these guidelines to the letter, and we've had a couple of folks tested, but they both came back negative. It would be a more difficult situation if we were to have a case in one of our homes, because many of our residents have underlying secondary physical health conditions in addition to their mental health challenges. And so they are a particularly vulnerable population. Diabetes, some of them have kind of early onset emphysema, some issues that are problematic. So we have to be very careful. Now, having said this, I think there's an important point to make here at this point, which is that the very premise of locking down, which has been the byword during this pandemic, runs completely counter to the philosophy of Ancoura, which is specifically designed to avoid isolation and loneliness. So right off the top, social responsibility may be the responsible and correct thing to do to avoid the transmission of COVID-19. However, from a mental health perspective, it is hardly benign and free of consequence. And what I mean by that is several of our residents have had to be hospitalized during the pandemic due to an aggressive recurrence of their symptoms. And furthermore, the protocol at the Royal Ottawa Hospital is to quarantine new patients to their hospital room for 14 days, which is a safe but even more isolating and lonely experience. So that has been a factor that, in fact, some of our residents have illnesses whose symptoms pre the pandemic exhibited a preference for isolation. So some of our folks already had tendencies in that direction, and the pandemic has given them a pretext to kind of burrow even deeper into that behavior. So that is a concern as well. We want people to socialize and to be part of their households and so on. And the pandemic in some ways has really helped some people just say, okay, well, I can stay in my room kind of thing. So the other thing is that as we've moved to checking in over the phone or with Zoom, which we've had to because we respected the public health guidelines about not entering the houses, the reality is that a Zoom call can only go so far as the medium fails to capture nonverbal cues and body language, which can tell you important things about someone's psychosocial well-being. So we do it, we accept it, but we understand that it is not a wholly adequate means of really assessing how somebody is feeling and doing and so on. And the other point I would make is that people on low incomes also have fewer options to distract from the tedium or monotony of a curtailed kind of lifestyle. So that, I believe essentially that the existing inequalities that we see in society prior to this event have been exacerbated a little bit by pandemic conditions. And that means that, insofar as mental and emotional well-being eventually can be predictors or precursors of physical health outcomes, this inequality and the lack of resources we think can be problematic if the pandemic persists. So basically, in terms of COVID-19, I would say that our experience, although we were locked down really only starting in March of last winter, but that winter poses the main problem for our residents. The summer has been okay. but the long Ottawa winter nights are a challenge. You then begin to realize that the virtual interactions that you're having with your residents are critical, but they can be limited themselves by the IT infrastructure, your internet bandwidth, the speed. What we've noticed is, because we obviously don't have the most top level package from our service provider, that when 2 or 3 of our residents are on the house internet at the same time, there are pausing, freezing, buffering issues that mean that it's not ideal. And there have been challenges with them conducting some of their meetings with their healthcare providers. And I think I would say that public health and income support agencies need to recognize the real limitations that in this kind of an environment that challenge folks who have diagnosed mental health conditions. So that's saying a little bit about some of the challenges, and I suppose that's inevitable, but I don't want to dwell entirely on those. We interview our residents periodically for our newsletter, which we produce, and I think there's a tremendous sense of pleasure and happiness that many of them experience once they become part of the Ancoura community and become part of a group of 3 folks in a home with visiting staff and volunteers. And this is just a quote from one of them. He says, "I've got the best home in the entire world. It's a home for the first time. For the last 12 years before recovery, I lived in a person's basement. It never felt like a home." And Kevin describes his new home as a platform for other beautiful things, such as volunteering. So, concluding thoughts. You can see there that we think our model is being tested, but it's holding up well. The pandemic has brought the need to follow the public health protocols to the fore and forced us to be extra vigilant. However, this can have consequences for folks who are accustomed to seeing family and friends, following certain routines, and enjoying liberty of movement. In some cases, their mental and emotional health has been adversely impacted. It has also affected the financial model upon which Ancoura has been based. Key fundraising events have had to be canceled, and new forms of pandemic-proof revenue generation are being explored. That's been a factor for me to contend with and the board. It's been a bit of a concern. And Ancoura relies greatly on the generous donations of its supporters, both monthly donors and those who give once or twice a year. And I want to say we're exceptionally grateful to those of you within the First Unitarian congregation who are donors. We are incredibly thankful to you. Like many other peer housing charities, the board, staff, and volunteers of Ancoura are determined to ensure that our residents emerge from the trials of COVID-19 with their health intact. And the board and the staff, I think, have been as proactive in this regard and have benefited significantly from the generosity of the Ottawa community. I wanted to close with a photo of Richard Hoey, who passed away this summer, who was a wonderful man. I only had the good fortune of meeting him once, just after I started in February of this past year. He was one of the founders of Ancoura, driving force, the first president, and really, the key engine in its early years of Ancoura. And I had the good fortune to meet him and just talk to him a little bit about his philosophy. When I just started, I wanted to know about the history, because I think that's pretty critical, and what his personal philosophy was. And so that was really lovely. And I would say, while he passed away this summer, that his legacy does live on. So, and that's kind of all I have to say. So thank you for hearing me, and I'll just stop screen sharing now and see if anybody has any questions.
Thanks very much, Chris. Paul McGinnis here. Sorry for being late to the party. My apologies. I'm looking to see if there are.
Can I just point out to Maury and whoever Zoom hosts that my chat is showing as being disabled, so it's not possible to send questions by chat.
Oh,
great. Okay. Yes. Oop. I came back and then left again.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see the chats. Can I just say?
Should be good now, Eva.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, apologies, Chris, for coming in. I won't explain all the problems I had in getting into a meeting.
No worries.
There is a question before I go. I just wanted to say for the UU members that I was going to say at the beginning that we're involved in Ancoura's exception in Ottawa from 2007, if people weren't aware of that. And in fact, Johnny Gall, our longtime member of the congregation, the mental health working group, actually created the name of Ancoura when it was just being started.
Right.
And we've engaged in various fundraising activities, and Ancoura's helped us with several services over the years. I see there's a question from Eva.
Paul, we don't mention who they're from because we're recording this and it's
I was told I could use the first name, but anyway.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, you want me to ask it? Okay. At the beginning, you mentioned when you're talking about the history in the Montreal Labrie project, that was the kind of the basis for Ancoura,
Right.
that there's kind of an optimal size. And just wondering whether Ancoura, whether you consider kind of your 7 homes to be the optimal size, or whether you're still looking to add additional homes.
I think we would like to add a few more, but I think we would take Labrie's approach as a sensible kind of template, because they've kind of maxed out at 10. So I think we would consider adding a few more, funds permitting, but I'm not sure. It would involve, clearly we would not be able to have the current coordinators dealing with that many homes and that many residents, so we would have to add staff in that case. So I think there's a willingness to maybe add a few more, but I don't think we'd get too much larger, no.
There's another question here, Maury. How does Ancoura model compare with the models used by other organizations who help individuals living with mental health challenges?
Well, I don't, I have to confess, I don't come with a long history of involvement in the housing sector, but in the limited time that I've been here, what I've learned about the congregate living sector is that there's a philosophy known as housing first, which is the general approach of most other housing service providers, where there's a list established and the next person on that list gets the place that is vacant or free in that home. And we don't follow that approach. We choose not to. We don't have any, for that reason, we don't have any public core government funding. We follow an approach where we decide who is the best fit for our home. In other words, we interview the potential resident, we establish their chemistry and suitability for the house, and we ensure that it works really well. So it's a slightly different philosophy. It's fairly unique in Ottawa, but it does mean that we don't have that core funding from the provincial government that some of those other agencies do have.
Chris, another question asked, what new funding initiatives, fundraising initiatives has Ancoura begun? Well,
we've obviously applied for our share of these emergency relief funds that different charitable organizations have made available. But I have to say, we've we've not had as much luck as I would have liked in that regard. I guess the various groups like the Community Foundations of Canada and the United Way and the Red Cross have been inundated with applications from charities. And we're not large and we're not national, so I think that might be a factor to a certain extent. But what we've been looking at more recently, we lost our revenues from our baseball concession. We used to have a 50-50 ticket concession with the Ottawa Champions. Now that franchise folded, but we were hoping that we might secure another one. But in lieu of the fact that, virtue of the fact that the sports are not being played at the moment, we're looking at what's called a virtual 50-50 ticket concession, where you get a license from the city and you can conduct an online 50-50 draw. And so that's one of the things we're looking at doing, of just making those ticket opportunities available online. We're also, like other organizations, looking at kind of meal arrangements as a takeaway kind of arrangement with a restaurant or a specialty food provider. We have to be a little bit sensitive about considering in-person dining. We want our demographic of our supporters is slightly older, and therefore we didn't want to run the risk of doing anything like that in the summer. So we're looking, but we're continuing to rely extensively on donations and applications. But I have to say that one of the challenges with applications, where there are sometimes requirements for new incremental type of activities or outcomes with the residents, is that our staff are already fairly taxed as it is. And so we have to be careful about the kind of funding that we do get, because we can't impose too many new requirements on our staff. So we are looking at a range of things.
On the topic of funding, does Ancoura receive funding from the province to cover some of the staff costs?
No. So as I mentioned a minute ago, we don't have any core public funding from the province. We currently, like many other organizations, have federal funding in the form of the wage subsidy, but we don't have any provincial funding.
And where are Ancoura residents going when they leave your residence?
So, well, there hasn't been a huge amount of, in fact, there hasn't been one person who's left in my brief 10-month tenure so far. But from what I understand in the past, they go into more independent living. So they might move into a shared apartment with one other person, or possibly move out on their own. So it tends to be, that's kind of this is kind of a stepping stone, a halfway position between where they were before and complete independence. So it would tend to be the next step if they're doing well. And we have about 3 or 4 of our residents who are actually working these days. So of the 21, so those people would be contemplating their own place, basically. And I thought, as a minor sociological detail, you might be interested that only one of our 21 residents has a car. So of all the folks, they rely massively on public transit and walking and bikes and so on, but only one has a vehicle.
Another question here, Chris. How long is the typical length of stay per residence? If it is long, it sounds like you take this as success, but would a shorter average stay not be a better indicator of success, as it indicates that a person has gained the life skills to live more independently?
That's a good question. I think, look, I'm not a social worker or somebody with a counseling credential, but I think that for some of these folks, their early years, their formative years, if you've ended up with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, there's been some trauma typically in your early back life or backstory. And for many of them, having a place where with the accent on support, encouragement, kindness, where there's no stigmatization, where you're accepted for whom you are, means that those people feel incredibly well housed with us. And I think they are accustomed to it and they like it. And perhaps there isn't a great desire to get out of there in some cases. And I'm not sure that that's such a bad thing. I think people, if they're comfortable in their home, and remember, that's what it is, we're providing a home, that then they should feel free to stay in that home,
a practical question here about how do you go about donating furniture?
Yeah, so well, we get quite a few offers for donations, and I've organized one move in my time here. So typically the person would reach out to me in the office, and then now this is a big if there's a need in a house, and to be honest, at this point, a number of our houses are chock-a-block full of furniture. We've had to put some in the basement, so it's not an immediate need. But if, for instance, as we had recently, a neighbor on my street has a suite of bedroom furniture that was very nice, and he was getting rid of it. So that was an upgrade. Hence, we moved out the stuff that was in there and moved this stuff in. So yeah, you can get in touch with me if you have some furniture.
I've attended some of your fundraising events in person, and this question is asking, have you considered trying your annual fundraising event online?
Yeah, so we initially thought about doing a virtual fundraiser back after we were forced to cancel our May event. The challenge, if I'm honest with you, is that for instance, things like the auction that we would hold, many of the prizes and gifts that normally are provided to us by businesses, donors, they weren't, you couldn't use them, they weren't tenable, in other words. And so there were some issues around that. I think, we would look at that in the future if it looks like we're faced with another cancellation. I know that we've been thinking that this year, out of a sort of precautionary approach, we're planning on holding the fundraiser not this coming May, but the coming September of 2021. Mm-hmm. We kind of feel we want to give it a few more months. So but we are open to pretty much anything at this point in terms of fundraising. Oh, it's frozen, the screen. Or Paul appears to have frozen.
Yes.
Yes. Chris, I see one more question in the chat. Is there a wait list for people who would like to live with Ancoura?
So there is an informal list that is kept by one of our coordinators, Jackie, and she keeps. I get requests. I actually get quite a few requests in the office for folks. Now, typically, the vacancies are fairly infrequent, and the process for vetting and approving somebody is quite lengthy. So it's a fairly slow process, I'm told, to move in because we need to establish the chemistry with the existing residents. But there is a way to get your name on there. We are happy to have the individual and/or their immediate family contact us, but quite often it's a social worker or a counselor who approaches us and says, I have a client or a patient who would like to consider moving in, and so we approach it that way.
So we seem to have lost Paul McGinnis. Are there any other questions? You can raise your virtual hand, or I'll. Yes, okay, so there's one here. Are there ways that First Unitarian individuals without mental health skills can participate and volunteer?
Yeah, so, well, we're always eager and keen to get new volunteers. And so obviously our primary focus at this point in time would be volunteers for the homes, what we call visiting volunteers. So we're very keen to get those kind of folks. And it's not an onerous commitment. It's a commitment that several times a month you would go, and in normal times, pre-pandemic times, you would have an outing, you'd go for a walk, go for a coffee. You just meet with them. We give you some training. There's a set of rules or a code of conduct that I mentioned earlier. But I think we found, given the longevity of many of our volunteers, that it's a very pleasant pastime, and that they form friendships and bonds with the residents and really enjoy their company. And it's mutual. The residents grow to regard their volunteers as as friends, as people that they can confide in a little bit, and who help them. They've often lacked that kind of a nice, formative, benign influence in their backgrounds, or not in every case, but in many cases. And so the volunteer provides a critical role in reintroducing and socializing people into feeling that they can have normal, healthy, stable relationships. So if you're interested, if you contact the office, I can put you in touch with our coordinator who handles that. We have an actual volunteer coordinator who looks after that particular thing.
Paul, I see you're back. Did you receive any other questions in private chat to you? There's one more in the general chat. Oh, looks like Paul might be frozen again. What does a visiting volunteer role look like during COVID restrictions is the latest question, Chris.
Yeah, good question. And it's, so it got a little better in the summer when they were able to do outdoor outings. So they would tend to involve kind of going for walks. And I think it got to a place where in some cases, a few volunteers were willing to drive folks places, everybody wearing a mask and all the windows down in the car, and they were able to do a few outings that way. But typically, it's been a bit tougher. It's been conducted virtually. So one thing that we have decided for this coming winter is that we're going to conduct a suite of activities for the residents and the volunteers that involve things like online cooking classes or virtual yoga, where there will be a lead volunteer who might possess some particular skill set or some expert body of knowledge. And then we will, using our internet connection, we'll set up so that everybody's online to do an online cooking class, or maybe an online painting or drawing class led by somebody. So those are some of the things we've had to default to, but normally those things happen in person.
Right, Paul is saying he's still with us, but it's intermittent. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment.
Thank you. You guys asked some really insightful and thoughtful questions, and I really appreciate you getting up on a Sunday and listening to my spiel about Ancoura. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
I see one more. How do we reach out if we want to get involved? I think, Chris, maybe you could put in chat some contact information for yourself, as well as sharing it verbally.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just type that in here. So you would start by going to our email address, our web address, which is there. And if you want to make a financial donation, there's a donate button on the website. If you want to get involved as a volunteer, then approach me and I will put you in touch with a volunteer coordinator. If you'd like to maybe help out with one of the committees. So the board has 3 or 4 committees, and some of the people who are on those committees are not board members, so they're more periodic helpers who would be engaged in things like fundraising, governance, communication. So if you have some web skills, if you're good at desktop publishing, if you'd like to help us with, there's all kinds of things that we have to do all year long, and we're looking for a variety of skill sets. So I think if you have something, or if you want to donate some furniture, if you're a dab hand at painting, any of those kinds of things, we can usually find a way to put your skills to use.
I see Andrew Drake has his hand up.
I was just going to say also, I don't know that if it was mentioned earlier or not, Chris, but your office is actually in the basement of the First Unitarian building. Yeah. So it's very convenient for anybody who, once we reopen, for people who can show up for a Sunday service, could also be within range to come in to help.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I should have mentioned that. You're right. We're in the basement, Unit 7, and it's a great location. We really love it. It's a lovely campus there. It's quiet, and it's really good.
No more questions, Paul. If you're able, maybe you could make make the closing remarks, and then we'll stop the recording and continue informally.
Okay, thanks, Maury. Thanks very much, Chris. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your introduction. I won't go into details of what happened. I wanted to thank you also to take the time, because I know it's a very busy period for you with the Ancoura AGM being held next Thursday, November 26th. So we really appreciate that you were able to take this time to talk to us, and want to assure you, at least for the mental health working group, that we'll continue our interest along with the congregation and the good work that you and your organization does. So thanks again very much.
Thanks, Paul.